All right, so welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. We are going to be talking about the Facilities and Capital Improvement Grant. This is the first webinar. We will also be offering a second webinar later in the process, but today we're going to be covering general information about the grant and diving a little bit more specifically into the letter of intent. Because I set this up as a meeting and not as a webinar, unfortunately, we don't have the Q&A feature available to us today. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can go ahead and enter those into the chat, and my colleague Allison will be keeping track of those for us. I will ask that everybody hold their questions. If you want to ask your questions verbally, please hold them until the end. We do have a lot of information to get through today. And again, apologies in advance for my voice and for the very text-heavy slides that we're going to be looking at today. But we do have a lot of information. It's really important that we get that information out and that everybody has the same chance to hear that information. So without further ado, and the other thing I wanted to say is that we are going to probably run up to about 45 minutes with the presentation, which will leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. I will stay on as long as necessary after our time is over to make sure everyone's questions get answered. If you have to leave before your question gets answered, go ahead and enter it into the chat, and I will answer that question on the recording, so you can always go back later and watch the recording as well. So we'll go ahead and get started here with today's agenda. So we have a lot to get through today. I'm going to take a few minutes to just talk about the background and funding source for where these funds are actually coming from. Some people need that information for their grant approval process internally. Also going to talk a little bit about contingencies with the Idaho State Legislature and our budget approval process. Then we'll go over the general timeline for the grant as a whole and kind of the process of the grant, the different steps involved in that. We'll talk very briefly about who is eligible to apply for this grant. That's not going to take a lot of time because the eligibility requirements are very few, but they are kind of important. Then we'll talk about what the funding amounts are and some questions we've received around funding, like partial funding and those sorts of questions. Then we'll dive deeper into the types of projects that are allowable under this grant and talk about allowable costs and some other really important requirements for the grant. And then we'll dive more deeply into what it means to enhance or expand your library. Excuse me, sorry. And we're going to walk through that requirement of jointly and directly enabling work, education, and health monitoring, as some people may want a little bit better idea of what actually that means. What does that look like in practice? Then we're going to talk about the letter of intent form more in depth, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. My slide progression here. Okay. So a little bit of background about these funds. The source of funds is through the Capital Project Funds, which is directed to us from the U.S. Treasury Department. But these are actually ARPA funds, which stands for the American Rescue Plan Act. These funds have been floating around for a while, so they are tied to the COVID pandemic. In general, Idaho has been allocated $3.5 million specifically for the purpose of improving library infrastructure. That money has been allocated to us by the Treasury Department. It is ours to use, but we have a few caveats in place around that, which I'll talk about on the next slide. We are reserving about 5% of those funds for internal use at ICfL to help with some of our operating and administrative overhead for running the grant, but the rest of it is all going out directly to libraries in the form of subgrants. And then just a purpose statement from the federal level, just so folks understand what the feds are kind of getting at with these funds, is the basic purpose is to carry out capital projects that directly enable work, education, and health monitoring in response to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19. And we'll talk a little bit about where COVID-19 plays into this, but we're taking a pretty broad approach to that, so hopefully that won't cause anybody too much heartburn on figuring out how to justify their project. So even though the U.S. Treasury Department has allocated these funds to the ICfL for the explicit purpose of library infrastructure, we don't just get to go out and spend them. Those funds have to be included in our budget, and we have to be given spending authority on our budget, and that is usually part of our budget approval process, which goes through the state legislature and is signed off by the governor. Last year, we did include these funds in our budget, but unfortunately, we were not granted the spending authority to use them. I'm not going to go into the whole politics of what happened last year. If you're interested in that, you can follow up with me separately after today's webinar. So we're going to try again this year. However, if the legislature, for whatever reason, chooses not to grant us the spending authority for these funds, that's going to be it. We're going to have to call it on this grant. And the reason for that is because if we try again next year, that will mean libraries will only have 2 years to carry out their project. And that's just really not a lot of time for capital projects and facilities improvement. So we hope to know by late March what is going to be the situation with our budget. Late March is usually when the legislature convenes in a normal year. And we have timed the release of the full application for this grant to be early April so that we can go forward with confidence, knowing that people are putting the time and effort into the application and we'll actually have those funds available. It is possible if the legislative session runs long, we may not have final approval on our budget or a really strong sense of approval on our budget before we have to release the full application for this grant. And we will be keeping everybody updated at every step along the way. As soon as we know something, you all will know something. Part of the reason for having folks submit a letter of intent is that gives us a really great contact list for people that we need to reach out to about these sorts of updates. All right, so the general timeline for this grant, before I dive into like the blow by blow of the different dates on this slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the process. And just because of the uncertainty with the legislative approval of our budget, we've split our application process into 2 steps. The first step is a letter of intent, which allows us to gather some basic information about you and your project to make sure what you intend to apply for is eligible. It also gives us a sense of like how popular this grant is going to be and helps us plan for the full application process. And it lets everybody get the ball rolling and started without committing to filling out a really long, complex grant application. And then we'll have the full application will come out in April once we know, have a better sense of where things stand with our budget. So that first step, the letter of intent, is due on February 27th. I do want to just give a caveat here that I am going to be out of the office on vacation on Friday, February 24th. So do keep that in mind as you're planning your timeline for submitting that. If you anticipate having any questions, you'll want to make sure that you get that process started so that you're not scrambling on the last day and I'm not available to answer those questions for you. March, as we discussed, March is going to be when we hope we have a firm sense of what's happening with our budget. And then early April, the application will be released. We'll give folks about 2 weeks with that application to just look it over, think it through, figure out what questions they might have. And then we will have another webinar in mid-April, kind of like this one, where people will have the chance to ask questions. We'll dive a little bit deeper into the application and that sort of thing. And then in late May is when the applications will be due. So you're going to have almost 2 full months to submit those applications. But because of the nature of this project, I really encourage you to take the full 2 months to do it. Don't wait until the last week before that application is due to get started. We anticipate that we'll have our decisions ready by early July. And everyone will receive notification whether you were selected or not. We won't leave anyone hanging, wondering what happened with their grant application. And then we anticipate being in a position to begin dispersing funds in early August. Some libraries may prefer to have that disbursement delayed until the start of their next fiscal year in October. We're totally open to that, but just so everyone knows, for those of you who are ready to go, early August is probably the soonest that we will be getting anybody any money. We'll be hosting another grantee webinar in August for those who were funded. And then your project period will run from August of 2023 through August of 2026. So this is a two-part performance period. It's a little bit different than some grants. Your funds have to be spent by August 2026, but your project also has to be done by August of 2026. So you have to meet both of those requirements. I don't, can't tell if you can see my hand here. So a lot of times your grant has to be spent by a certain point, even if your project isn't done. In this case, both of those things have to be true. So do keep that in mind. So in terms of who is eligible to apply for this grant, it's pretty straightforward. This grant is open to tax-funded public libraries in Idaho as defined in Idaho code. I have cited that code here. So basically it's city and district libraries. If you're not sure if you qualify under either of these codes, feel free to reach out to us. Clay Ritter is going to be a great contact point for you to help you figure that out. He is our public library consultant, and he is also on the call with us today. The other requirement is that the library has to be open to and serve the general public. So you can't just be a special population library that only serves a specific group of the population. And then finally, in order to receive grant funds through this, you have to have a current and valid UEI number. I am not going to get into details on the UEI number on this call, but if you need assistance with that in any capacity, please let me know. I can put you in touch with our grants officer. We do have some information about how to get that process started. I would start that as soon as possible because this is not going to be the only ICfL grant where you're going to need that number. So that's going to be something that you're going to want for all grants going forward into the future. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about funding here. We have broken because it's such a large pot of money, we have broken the funding out into 3 tiers. Kind of the reason for this is so that people who want to submit for a very small facilities improvement project aren't competing against people who are like remodeling or building a new building. So small projects will be competing against other small projects, medium projects and large projects will all be kind of competing and rated within their own group. And so I've included the information here. I just want to reiterate here that we are very open to applications in Tier 1 and Tier 2. If you have a smaller project, you're only wanting to remodel one room in your library, that's totally fine. This does not have to be one of those projects where you feel like you can't apply unless you're trying to build a whole new library. Very open and welcoming of small projects, medium and large projects. The total number of grants that we fund is going to be kind of dependent on how many applications we receive within each tier, and what are the requested amounts of those applications. Excuse me. So a couple other questions related to funding that we've received. Some folks have asked, can we combine this grant with other grants to support our project? Absolutely, you can do that. The only thing you're going to need to keep in mind is even if this grant only represents 10% of your overall project budget, the project itself has to comply with the grant, which means it has to meet the requirements for work, education, and health monitoring, and it has to be substantially complete by August of 2026. So if this grant funds any portion of your project, it has to meet those really big requirements. Can this, when I say sole source here, I'm not talking about procurement. I think it's more just people have been asking, can this grant be the sole source of funding for the project? Absolutely, especially if you have a smaller grant and you want to, or a smaller project and you want to apply for the entire amount to cover the cost of that project, you can certainly do that. We are open to that as well. There's no matching requirement for this grant, so you don't have to contribute anything on your end. You don't have to have other funds in place. You don't have to have, operating or savings money that you're going to contribute. That being said, it's always a good idea to have some contingency plans because, with inflation and everything, costs can go up. So, your best laid plans today may not cover all of the costs 2 years from now. So just keep that in mind. And then we've also received the question of whether we'll consider partial funding, and the answer to that is yes. So what that means is, let's say you apply for $100,000. We may grant you $50,000 if we really like your project, but we just don't have enough funds to cover the entire amount that you've requested. So what that means in practice is that you will want to request the full amount that you actually want to ask for. And if we can't fund that full amount, we will still consider funding you part of that amount. It's not an all or nothing kind of situation. We will also check with you first before we pursue a partial funding to make sure that you're willing to accept partial funding and that that's going to work for your plans. So now a little bit about what kind of projects are allowable under this grant. Like I said before, a couple slides ago, we welcome projects of all sizes. So everything from, maybe just remodeling a single room in your building to make it easier to use and accommodate more people, all the way up to brand new buildings and, down to the stud renovations. We are also open to projects that are at all phases. So everything from an early conception, you haven't even really done any work around it yet, all the way to projects that have already started, or maybe you even have a project that's mostly done, but you need a grant to help cover the finishing touches like the furniture and the equipment and that sort of thing. So we're open to all of those. What I would say though is to keep in mind the combination of your project size with your project phase. So it's really very likely and possible that a small project, you could be starting from zero and expect that project to be done within 3 years by August of 2026. If you're looking at a really, really big project like building a whole new library and you haven't even started that process yet, you're going to want to be really honest with yourself about whether it's likely you're going to have enough time to get that project done. If you're starting with, you don't even have architectural plans, you don't have anything yet, and you're hoping to have a new building, is that likely to happen in 3 years? We're not going to say no, we're not going to deny your application, but we are going to look closely at the feasibility of your projects. Just to kind of give you a sense of how long things are taking right now. We had some bookmobiles in our last ARPA grant that took almost 2 years from the point of getting that bookmobile ordered to delivered. So just kind of keep those timelines in mind. The other requirement for the project is that it has to enhance or expand the library. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more later, so I won't cover that right now. The project also has to directly and jointly enable work, education, and health monitoring. Again, we're going to dive into that a bit more later. And then these last two are kind of things that have kind of come down to us from the federal level. They're kind of attached to that federal source. And the first is that this project really needs to be in direct response to a need in the community. And that's usually a good thing to assume for most grant projects. It really needs to be responding to your community's needs and not just something that's nice to have and cool, but isn't really related to anything that's going on in your community. And then the last item here is that your project has to be addressing a need that's in response to something that was created, exacerbated, or made apparent by the COVID pandemic. I think between those three things, created, exacerbated, or made apparent, gives us a pretty wide berth to work with here in terms of justifying projects. I think at this point, we can all do a pretty good job of explaining how the COVID pandemic exacerbated or made apparent the need for our services and for expanding how we serve the community. But if you have any questions about that or you're not sure your project meets that requirement, reach out and let me know. I'm happy to talk you through that. There we go. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about allowable costs. Pretty broad bucket here for what you are allowed to spend grant funds on. Anything that's a direct expense of construction, renovation, or improvement. So things like construction materials, construction labor, fixtures, furnishings, equipment, shelving, all of those direct expenses are allowable. You're also allowed to spend grant funds on contractual services, so hiring an architect, an interior designer. Maybe you want to hire a consulting firm to help you walk through this entire capital improvement project. Those are all allowable expenses as well. And then anything related to planning and coordination of the project. So that does include staff time. So if you're director or you have somebody else on staff who's really leading the charge for this, you can charge their time to the grant. You will need to have a system in place for tracking their time and effort, but beyond that, absolutely. And then any kind of other just sort of general costs, like if you want to conduct a community needs assessment to figure out like what your community would like the space to look like, any feasibility studies, or if you have to do like an environmental review or anything, those types of costs can also be charged to the grant. So now things that you cannot charge to this grant. Now, you can't charge these costs to this grant. If you're combining this grant with other sources of funding and these are allowable costs for the other sources of funding, go for it. You can charge these to that grant. You just can't charge them to this grant. So any costs related to programming or collection development, except where those are directly necessary in order for the space to fulfill its functions. I was struggling to come up with an example for this, which to me kind of means that there's probably not going to be a lot of cases where this will be the case. If you want to make an argument for it, go for it, but those types of expenses will be given lower priority. Excuse me. So other costs that are not allowable to be charged to this grant would include the cost of any kind of normal ongoing upkeep and maintenance that you would expect for any building. So anything that doesn't significantly expand or enhance the library's function. So things that you would have to do to your building regardless, like replace the roof every 20 years, replace the siding every 10 years, replace the windows, those sorts of things. Sorry, guys. So other things that are not allowable to this grant would be any kind of changes that are just cosmetic. So just slapping on a new coat of paint in your children's room and that's all you're going to do, that's not going to be allowable under this grant. New carpet, those sorts of things. The exception to the last two items would be if you needed to make these type of changes to one part of your library in order to be able to accommodate changes to another part of your library where it's all part of a bigger project. So like if you were to add a new wing or an extension on your library and you wanted the carpet to match throughout the whole library, so you would replace the carpet in more than just the new construction, that would be fine. Or if you have to replace the entire roof in order to have a roof that accommodates your new construction, that would be fine too. All right, so if you have tuned out, I'm going to ask you to tune back in again. I know there's a lot of information going on, but these three things on this slide are going to be really important and you're probably going to get sick of hearing them, but I want to make sure that everybody has heard and understood these three requirements. So I'll give you a second to tune back in again. Okay, so the first of these three, these are kind of other requirements. I wasn't sure where they would fit in, so I kind of put them in this area of the presentation. But the first is that whatever space you build with this grant has to be open to the general public. So you can't build a meeting room that is only for the purposes of a specific organization or can only be used by children. If you enhance staff space, that's okay if it's part of a bigger project, but if your grant is only to enhance your staff space, that's probably not going to meet this requirement. So just keep that in mind. It has to be open to the general public. The project itself has to be substantially complete by August of 2026. That is 3 years from this summer. And by substantially complete, the feds have defined this as being able to fulfill its primary operations, being able to deliver service to the end user, and all of its primary systems are functional. So maybe if there's a delay in getting that final coat of paint on, that might not be as big of a deal. But if you're just breaking ground in 2026 and your building is not even done yet, that's going to be a big problem. You may be asked to pay your grant funds back. And then The other really important requirement here, and this one will probably be more applicable to those of you who are tenants who don't own your facility or who have any kind of long-term plans to leave your current facility in the next 10 years or so. Whatever project is funded with these grant funds has to remain open to the public and in operation for at least 5 years following the close of the grant. So that's 5 years after 2026, so that means 2031. So just make sure that if you're maybe remodeling your current building or you're a tenant who wants to do some tenant improvements, just make sure that you are in a comfortable, confident place that you're going to be in that building through 2031 so that you don't run up against any issues of not meeting that 5-year requirement. Okay, so what counts as enhancing or expanding your library? So we said that certain changes aren't, or certain costs are not allowable. So things like a new roof or slapping on a coat of paint because they don't enhance or expand your library. So basically what this means is that whatever project you fund with this grant has to result in improvements to how the library is used and how the space is used to meet the needs of the community. So that means things like being able to accommodate more people. Maybe you're expanding the footprint and you can actually expand your occupancy. Or maybe you're not necessarily expanding your occupancy or footprint, but you're enhancing the space so that it's more flexible and can accommodate a greater number and types of uses. Another thing that would qualify would be improving your facility to be able to accommodate a larger number and type of resources. The only caveat on that one is if that's the only one of these 4 things that you're looking at, you might have a harder time talking about how that's going to meet the work education and health monitoring, but you could certainly make an argument for that. And then the 4th item would be any kind of changes that allow you to adapt to the future, kind of future-proofing your library, whether that's your digital infrastructure or just the way that your library is used, making sure that you're thinking 20 years ahead and that your library can accommodate the next 20 years of service. So what does this mean in practice? So I've included some examples of things that would count as enhancing or expanding your library. The first thing is I want to put this out there in case some libraries are thinking, well, gosh, this isn't a great opportunity for me because we're not in a great place to build a new library or to even build a new wing. We just have bad plumbing and nobody can come to this part of the library because the roof has been leaking and there's black mold growing, or there's something else going on in your library that makes a certain portion of your library either unusable or unsuitable. So if you wanted to use this grant to cover repairs that would then open up that portion of the library or make it somehow more usable for the public, that is absolutely allowed. So if you needed to rehabilitate a portion of your library that is currently closed down to the public because of some issue, you can certainly use these grant funds to cover that. You can also use grant funds to redesign or renovate an existing space. So again, not necessarily expanding your footprint, but maybe taking a space and reimagining it to be more flexible and fluid. This could be anything from kind of starting from scratch, tearing down to the studs and building, movable walls, or you might just have a space that has been mostly renovated, but what you're really looking for is you need some new, what we call them FFEs, which is furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So maybe using grant funds to purchase furniture and equipment that is really flexible in how it's used and can be used in a variety of different ways. That would be an option as well. And then, of course, expanding the footprint of your library is a pretty easy way to accommodate the enhance or expand requirement. So increasing the interior square footage would definitely count. You might also think about enhancing your outdoor usable programming space. So we're not talking, beautification here. We're not talking cosmetic upgrades with some pretty flowers. We're talking about like actual changes to the space and how it's used to allow you to have programming and services that meet the requirement of this grant. And of course, brand new construction is absolutely allowable as well. So building a new facility, or even maybe you're keeping your current library, but you're adding a second building on site. Those things would be allowable as long as, again, they are substantially complete by August of 2023. And then another option would be using grant funds to help you purchase an existing building to use as a new library, as well as any costs of upgrading that building to meet the really specific high standards of library structural integrity. Because for those of you who don't know, libraries actually require some more building support in order to support the cost of, or the weight of your collection. Okay, so directly and jointly enabling education, work, and health monitoring. Again, this is kind of a requirement that's pushed down onto us by the feds. It's attached to the source of funding. So when they say directly, what they mean is the space itself has to allow either the library or a partner to facilitate and offer qualifying services. And we're going to get into that in a moment. But one thing I want to point out here is that these services don't have to be the sole function of the library or the space that you're building. So maybe the space you're building can accommodate work, education, and health monitoring, but it can also be used for other library programming, for story hour, for craft night. It doesn't have to just sit vacant and empty when it's not being used for these functions. And then jointly means that the resulting space or project has to address all three requirements. So education and work and health monitoring, not just one or two, but all three. I've included the definitions of work, education, and health monitoring here, but I am not going to go over them just as a matter of time. But for those of you who might be watching this webinar again later and want to pause it here to read these definitions are also on the website if anyone wants to look them over. I think what folks are probably more interested in is hearing, okay, so what does this look like in practice? How can I, meet these requirements for education, work, and health monitoring? That seems like a lot. Well, the good news is you're probably doing this already. And it's not going to be hard for you to address these requirements if you just think about creating a flexible multi-use space that can accommodate a lot of different uses and people. One thing you might want to keep in mind is when you're looking at your space is having both open and public spaces as well as private spaces, or a way to convert the space between public and private. So think about how you use that space is really going to be how you're going to address these requirements. So, in your big open spaces, think about hosting literacy classes, adult ed and GED classes. Think about hosting community health screenings, or maybe partnering with your local Department of Labor office to host some skills training classes, or maybe even a career fair. All of those things would meet this requirement. And then think about how you might use your private spaces for tutoring or quiet study areas for education, meeting with occupational counselors or caseworkers for the work requirement, and making space available for telehealth appointments, which would meet that health monitoring requirement. So as you can see, you're not having to build a separate space for each of these components. You're really just building space that can accommodate all three of these components and being flexible in how you use that space. You may also want to think a little bit about not just programming and services, but how people interact with your resources and how people go about their self-directed activities. So making sure that your space is easy to navigate, that your resources are easy to locate and to browse. So for those people who might want to be doing self-directed activities around education, work, and health monitoring, that when you're improving or enhancing your space, you're thinking about physical accessibility, but also just like how things are organized, how people interact with things, and making sure that your space that you're creating is welcoming and comfortable as well. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit here. We talked a little bit about, or we talked a lot actually, about the background of the grant and what's allowable and the types of projects. And now we're going to shift gears and talk more specifically about the letter of intent itself. Since we have not gotten a lot of these submitted, I'm assuming that a lot of people are waiting until after this webinar and maybe still waiting on their board to get that letter of approval. So hopefully some of this will be helpful for you as well. The first thing to know about the letter of intent is you do have to submit one in order to get access to the full application. You will not be invited to apply and you won't have access to the application unless you submit a letter of intent. That being said, if you submit a letter of intent, it will not obligate you to submit a full application. So even if you're on the fence and you're thinking, well, we might want to get a grant under this, but we're not totally sure, I would encourage you to submit the letter of intent because it will allow you access to the next phase of this project. But if you change your mind in the course of time, between now and when the application is released, that's totally okay. It's not going to prevent you from applying for future grant opportunities. It's not going to, make you look bad in our eyes or anything like that. We understand that things change, and that's fine too. Think of the letter of intent as sort of a low stakes opportunity for us and you to determine if this is a good fit for each other. It's a good opportunity for you to start thinking critically and logically about your project and start to make those commitments to take it to the next step and working with your board. But it's sort of a low stakes opportunity for doing that. And then it also gives us a chance to sort of make sure that you are eligible, that your project is eligible before you have to create a really big, long application that might take a lot more time and effort. Also, the letter of intent will be used to create our primary contact list for this project. So it's really important that you submit a letter of intent so that you get updates as well, and that the information you put on that letter of intent is correct and accurate. And then finally, we're going to be using, on our side of the equation, we'll be using a letter of intent to determine sort of the level of interest in the grant. And this will help us plan for the application phase and kind of knowing how many grants we're going to get of different sizes, what kind of technical assistance people are likely going to need for this. And it'll help us get all of our ducks in a row so that that application process is smooth and efficient for everybody. So with regard to the letter of intent form that you all have to fill out, when you open it up, it's going to look really long because there's a lot of background information on there, but it's not actually that long of a form to fill out. It's primarily multiple choice questions. There are 3 brief narrative questions that require you to submit at least 75 words, but no more than 200 words. This is not application level responses. This is general high level responses to get us all started on getting acquainted with your project. You do have to upload that letter of approval from your library's governing body. I did get a question recently about this. Like what needs to actually be included in the letter from your board. I would say that the level of detail we need in that letter should be about the same as the level of detail that you will be putting into the form itself. So it needs to be enough detail that we feel confident that the board understands what the project is, but it doesn't need to be super in-depth or anything like that. So even a one-page letter from your board should be more than sufficient. With regard to the LOI form that you're going to be filling out, all of the questions are required except the one if you're the director, but everything else is required. So that means you have to respond to that question before you can hit the submit button. Additionally, some of the questions on the form are considered qualifying questions, which means those are sort of eligibility questions that if you answer in a certain way, it may disqualify you from this project. Please answer those honestly because it's going to save everyone a lot of time and effort if we know that your project is not likely going to be a qualifying project. We can save everybody time and effort right now. And we want to make sure that this grant is a good fit for everybody. Also keep in mind that your project might not fit neatly into any one of the categories on those multiple choice questions, and that's okay. Just choose the option that is like the best fit for your project. It might not be an exact fit. The letter of intent is not going to determine whether you're getting funding or not right now. This is just to help us get familiar with your project and make sure that it qualifies for being eligible to submit a full application. And then again, with those narrative responses, there's only 3 of them. They're very brief. Just provide enough detail to give us a sense of the project, but be succinct. So this is not your funding application. You don't have to give us a kitchen sink on this one. We really just want to get a high level idea of what you're going to be doing with your money. So now I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint. And I'm going to switch over to sharing the actual letter of intent that you will see when you go online to fill that out. And then we're going to just look at that really quickly together in case anyone hasn't had a chance to look at this yet. And that'll kind of give us all a sense of what that looks like. And since that's on my other screen, I'm going to be looking off to the side here. But just a quick thumbs up, maybe Allison, you're seeing that okay? Great. Okay, so this is what you're going to see when you click on the link from the website to fill out this form. As you can see, there's a lot of information up front. Not going to repeat that here because we just talked about all of this in today's webinar. And apologies if this is making anybody car sick. Okay, so the first section, pretty straightforward. It's just your applicant information, standard stuff here. The only thing I want to point out in this section is the preparer's name. Whoever is listed as the preparer is going to be the primary point of contact for the grant. So if you have, let's say you have a contract grant writer who actually prepared the letter of intent, if you put that contract grant writer's name here, they're going to get all the correspondence about the grant. So just make sure that that's what you actually want. If there's a member of staff that needs to be the person getting the correspondence, that's who you're going to want to have in the preparers section. If the preparer is not the library director, for some of the larger libraries, please make sure that you also include the name and email address for the library director so that they can get a copy of the letter of intent and know that it has been submitted. So we're just going to really quickly go through the questions here. Question 1 is just confirming that you're an eligible library under Idaho State Code. Question 2 is where you're going to upload the letter of approval from your board. You will not be able to hit submit unless something is uploaded here. If you have any concerns about the timing of this, if you have any concerns about getting a letter of approval from your board by February 27th, please reach out to me right away. I will consider some exceptions to this and some workarounds on a case-by-case basis, depending on your circumstances. Question 3 is just a really broad question around the type of project you're going to be submitting. So are you making changes to your current facilities? Are you expanding? Are you acquiring a new facility? Are you building something new? Just kind of a general, again here, pick the one that's the most appropriate, that's going to really cover like 80 to 90% of what your project is doing. Question 4 is just asking you where in the process you are. Are you just conceiving of things? Do you have your plans in place? Have you purchased stuff already? Are you in the midst of construction? Are you mostly finished and putting on the final touches? Those sorts of things. That'll help us understand where you are in your project. Number 5 is a qualifying question. This is sort of where you're choosing, you can choose one or all 4. This is where you tell us how your project will be enhancing or expanding. And rather than have you type up a response, you just get to choose from a multiple choice list here. So more patrons, more variety of uses, larger number of resources, and upgrading your digital infrastructure. So choose any and all that apply to you, but you have to choose at least one. Question 6, please answer this one honestly to the best of your ability. Will this project be substantially complete by August of 2026? Is it realistic for you to get the project you're proposing done by 2026? And then question 7 is where you're going to just provide us a really high-level overview of your project. So if there's anything awkward about your project that maybe you needed to clarify because it doesn't fit into one of the multiple choice questions very well, this would be the place you could do that as well. But basically just a high-level overview of why you're doing it, what it's going to look like, what the end result is going to look like. So we just get, this is a 200, at most 200 words. So that's, a couple paragraphs is all we're looking for here. So please just be clear and succinct. Then we have repeated the definitions of work education and health monitoring. So those are actually embedded in the form, so you don't have to refer anywhere else for those while you're filling this out. Question 8 is going to ask you, how do you foresee that this project will meet the requirements of directly and jointly enabling those areas of work education and health monitoring? Again, this is high level, 200 words or less, couple paragraphs. Just give us a general sense of how you anticipate and envision your project meeting this requirement. And then question 9 is going to asking for a dollar amount here. It's okay to not have this dollar amount totally finalized yet. What we're looking for is, first of all, to kind of get a sense of which of the tiers that your project falls into. And then also just, if you can try to come within 25% or $30,000 of your project cost, whatever's more appropriate depending on the size of your project. So if you really don't have any clue as to how much your project is going to cost, now is the time to start reaching out to contractors and architects. You may be able to pay somebody a small fee to just give you a ballpark estimate to come talk to you about that. The dollar amount that you enter here does not obligate you to request that same dollar amount in the application. So let's say you put $100,000 here, and then when the application is released, you start doing your more in-depth budget planning, and you realize this is going to cost maybe closer to $200,000. That's okay. Just try to get as close as possible here. But if that dollar amount changes on your final application, that's not a problem at all. Question number 10 is whether this grant will cover the entire cost of the project or whether you're going to be combining this with other funds. If you're combining it with other funds, then please answer question 11, which is how you plan to get other funds. How are you going to be fundraising for the rest of the cost of this project? Again, this is very high level stuff. We don't need more than a few paragraphs here, but we just want to get a sense of, that you have a realistic picture of what you're going to be doing moving forward. And then finally, question 12 is whether you have a UEI number or not. If you don't have one yet, that's okay. That won't disqualify you from applying, but it may help us understand which libraries might need more technical assistance around this particular component to make sure you have a UEI number, because you will not get $1 from us for this grant until we have documentation of that UEI number. So even if your project is selected for funding, you won't get any of the money until that UEI number is in place. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing here. Those are all of the things that I had. So we have about 10 minutes left for questions and answers. Don't panic though, I will stay on as long as I need to in order to get everyone's questions answered. And then I'm going to pull up my chat here. So it looks like, Allison, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see that we've had any questions come in through the chat. I know I was going really fast, so people may not have wanted to stop and type up their question because they were afraid they were going to miss something. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking for just a second. But really quickly, before we start the Q&A, if you are more comfortable submitting your question in writing in the chat, please do that. We will make sure we cover all of those. If you would like to ask a question verbally, go ahead and raise your hand. Allison will help me keep track to make sure that we have gotten everybody whose hand is raised. As you can maybe see, Gina has put her hand up. That's a great way of letting us know, because then you can take your hand down once we've addressed your question. In order to do that, if you're not familiar, along the bottom of your screen is a little smiley face that says reactions, and you can click the option to raise your hand there. So I'm going to go ahead and get started answering questions, unless Allison, was there anything from the back end?
We are getting a couple questions in the chat, just so you know, as well.
So I'm awesome. Okay, so I'm going to start with Gina, since she does have her hand up, and then we'll move over to the chat and start going through stuff. Gina, go ahead. Can't hear you, you're on mute. Gina, you're on mute. Still can't hear you. There we go. Okay, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we're looking at is we have a person in town who's bought a parcel. It's got a building on it now. He's looking at knocking it down this summer and starting to build. So what I'm trying to do is go in with him, and it looks like we'll be the second and third floor. Is this grant going to be okay to cover that? Because we're expecting to be there more than the 5 years you were talking about. So
yeah, I think this can cover that. And again, if you submit a letter of intent, that will also be an opportunity for us to look at your project, and we can always follow up with you if we think there's any questions that maybe this project wouldn't qualify. So again, the letter of intent is really low stakes in terms of get that submitted. We'll take a look at it. If we have any doubts that that project would qualify, we will let you know. And the other thing, I don't think that that's going to be a concern for the 5-year thing. The only thing I would think with that particular project is if you haven't done any architectural work or haven't broken ground yet, you're going to want to be really realistic with yourself around that being done by August of 2026 question.
Well, in my letter of intent and my letter from the board, I sent both those in Monday night. I said that we didn't have a contractor. He has a contractor already in place, and they have things drawn up. So I'll be visiting with them hopefully later this week. So we'll get going on that.
All
right.
We're
hoping to get going this summer. So
sounds good. Okay, thanks, Gina.
Thank
looks
you.
like we have some questions in the chat. I will read the question out loud for the sake of the recording. The first question: if we are to add square footage to our library, are we required to bring our bathrooms and fire systems up to code? Will these expenses fall under the grant? Whether you're required to bring them up to code is going to be a local issue. That's going to be a local issue with your current and local building authority, whoever approves your building plans. I'm not a construction expert. I would think that you would want to bring those up to code, but if you are required to bring those up to code, then I do think the grant could cover those expenses. I do think that would be an allowable expense for this.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Next question: can we use the money to replace our aging and problematic HVAC system? Yes, but so if replacing the HVAC system was the only thing you were doing, you would need to justify how that enhances or expands your library, and you would need to justify how that helps you meet the requirement for work education and health monitoring. However, if you are doing the HVAC as part of a bigger renovation, absolutely, HVAC could be included if it's one component of a bigger project that meets all of those requirements. Next question: are there any requirements associated with federal funding tied to this grant, such as Davis-Bacon wages, Buy American, and NEPA? That is a great question. I do not know the answer to that. Allison, would you mind capturing that question so we can do some further research, and then we will probably post that under the FAQ sections on the website. Thank you for that question. Somebody asked, where is the final funding decision made, at the state or federal level? That decision will be made here by the ICfL. So we will have a local state level grant review committee that will consist probably of ICfL staff and probably some community partners. We haven't gotten that far yet. We want to make sure that everything looks good to move forward before we start convening that review panel. Great question. So no, you're not going to have to wait on a federal decision because that would be awful. Okay. Next question. Are there any purchasing requirements such as requiring an RFP or specific number of quotes? I don't think so, but Allison, if you could capture that question from Lindsay. I don't think that there are, but Clay has his hand up, so I'm going to let him maybe jump in here.
So as far as purchasing requirements, you will need to follow state statute, obviously, when it comes to any purchasing, because you are a public entity doing the purchasing. So any RFPs, et cetera, would come directly from state statute as far as your bid processes and acceptance of those bids, et cetera.
Thanks. And Clay is going to be a great point person. If you have questions, he may not advise you on the bidding process, but he can point you to the applicable state code so that you know where you need to look for those requirements. But I don't think that there are any federal requirements for this other than just what your standard federal requirements would be for any federal funding source. But maybe Allison, if you could write that one down, we can follow up on the federal end as well. So somebody asked if we could please re-display the slide from the first part of the presentation that addressed FFE. I can, but maybe if that was a question from Steve, I might be able to just, did you have a specific question, or were you just hoping to capture that information, because this webinar is being recorded, so you should have access to that later.
I'm hoping to capture the slide because I've got somebody that is like in overdrive about this, and I need to address this grant with them as quickly as possible.
Okay, Steve, if you could enter your email address into the chat, Allison will capture that, and I can send you that slide as soon as we're done.
Okay, thanks.
And FFE just stands for Furniture, Fixtures, and Equipment, in case anybody was wondering what that was in reference to. And then we have another question here. Would the collection development restrictions still allow for kits that address the 3 elements? So, like I said with that, the collection development part is not necessarily forbidden for spending these grant funds, but it is going to be given lower priority, and it really needs to be like necessary for that space to fulfill its function. I think if you want to include the cost of kits in your grant application, I mean, we'll look at it. It won't disqualify you from submitting an application, but you know, we may choose not to fund that portion of the application depending on what other people are asking for. If you can make a really strong case for how those kits are required in order for that space to fulfill its final function, you're welcome to make that argument in your application. All right. So that is all the questions that were answered in the chat. Wow, we are still under our time. So does anyone else, let me just scroll over. I am only seeing some of the folks here. I don't see anyone that has their hand up. Gina, you still have, it shows your hand is still up, but I'm not sure if maybe that is just left over from before. Did you have
actually, I had another question.
Okay.
Say we don't get the grant to build a new building and we want to go in and remodel ours. The basement is falling apart, and I found out last year that we have asbestos down there. Would that cover asbestos removal?
If you're currently not able to use the basement to its full capacity because of that, then yeah, I think that would fall under that. Conducting repairs that allow you to use what was previously an unsuitable or uninhabitable portion of the building.
Okay, that's what I needed. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Looks like we have another question. So somebody said, getting the exact dollar amount will be tough. Is there room at the end of the grant to give money back or ask for more? Asking for more is probably not likely unless other people have given money back, because we intend to award out every dollar that we can. So if you don't use the full amount of your grant and you need to give money back, I mean, what we'll probably do is work with you on figuring out how you might reimagine the remaining grant dollars to you know, but I think with inflation and with unexpected costs, construction always ends up costing more rather than less. I have never been in the position where a construction project has cost less than what we thought. But, you know, we also realize that it's really hard to predict every cost that's going to be associated with a project like this. So do your best, but I would overestimate slightly. Don't ask for the moon because we do have a lot of other people asking for projects here as well. But, you know, I would err on, you know, overestimating by a few percentage points as opposed to underestimating. And then if you end up having savings throughout the project and you have money left over, the sooner you can let us know that, the better, because then what we'll do is work with you on maybe other options for you to spend those funds that still qualify under the grant, or if you really just want to give them back, the sooner we know that, the sooner we're able to maybe offer those funds to another library or re-grant them out to somebody whose project is maybe running a little over. Another question, since it is a competitive grant, will we receive an example rubric to help us form our request? Only to the extent that we do example rubrics for other competitive grants. I'd have to check to see if that's our standard practice, if that's something that we do with all of our competitive grants. I'm not opposed to it. I just want to make sure that we're being consistent. The application itself will probably be pretty explicit about the number of points that are being assigned to each question. And we will have a full webinar like this one after the full application is released, where people can ask all of those types of questions as well. We don't have the rubric designed yet because we're kind of waiting until we have a better sense of where things are going with the budget. Great question though. Any other questions people may have? Don't see any hands up. All right, well, it is officially, we're at our hour mark. I will be happy to stay on for just a couple more minutes in case somebody's formulating a question. Okay, so somebody did ask, when do we expect to know if this is funded by the legislature? So just a quick point of clarification, we're not being funded by the legislature, we're getting approval for our spending authority. The funding actually comes from the feds, but we hope to have our budget approved or to know whether our budget has been approved or not, and if that spending authority is in place probably by the end of March. That's when the legislature normally convenes. Sometimes they run longer if they have a lot of stuff going on, but we anticipate the end of March is when we're going to know. And we'll be sending that information out to everybody who submitted an LOI so that you all know where things stand. All right, well,
can I just add,
yeah.
Amelia, that it's not too late to contact your local legislator and let them know that you think these projects are important and that you would appreciate their support and kind of just provide some education. It goes a long way. We need those 36 yes votes in the House and half of the Senate. So it's not too late to get the word out and schedule some meetings with those folks. They're important stakeholders.
Awesome. Yes, thank you for that plug, Stephanie. I'm glad you remembered to follow up on that. Well, I'm not seeing anything else coming through the chat, and I'm not seeing anybody else with their hand up. So I'm going to assume that everybody has asked the questions that they have right now. That doesn't mean you're precluded from submitting questions to me later. My information, hopefully you all have it. I will type it into the chat really quickly in case you don't. You're more than welcome to contact me directly if you feel more comfortable asking a question one-on-one than in a group setting. That's totally fine. And I will stay on for a few more minutes just in case anybody else is still formulating a question. But if you need to hop off the call, feel free to do that. This will be recorded and posted in full on our website probably within a day or two. And so thank you everybody for joining us today. I know that was a lot of information to absorb. So again, please reach out with any questions that you might have, posting my email right now into the chat. And I hope the rest of you all have a great rest of your day. Like I said, I'm just hanging out just to make sure there's nobody else who wanted to hang out for just a few extra minutes and ask a question. Maria, you had a question? Looks like you're still muted.
Oh, I just wanted to say goodbye.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Yep. Take care.
Amelia, I do have a question.
Sure.
I didn't get on until about halfway through, so I'm going to go back and watch the recording. I have a scenario out here that is even different than the one we talked about. So I'm now understanding that that second building that my city already owns could potentially be the one that they would want me to get the grant for, rather than our existing building. With that said, my board wants me to go to my city council and ask that. Is that correct? That I can use it towards, write my letter of intent towards this new building that the city owns?
Yeah, so in
Okay.
general, yeah, I think that would be fine. And if we see any red flags in your letter of intent, we'll follow up with you, especially if it's something we're like, this might be disqualifying, so we'll clarify with you before we just assume that you're disqualified. So we're not going to just, say sorry.
Okay.
If there's any question at all, we'll definitely touch base with you
Okay.
about it first. Yeah.
Well, like I said, I'm essentially having to write up two because my board says they want me to go before city council and use whatever letter city council decides on. Because we own both buildings, we're paying for both buildings, and
Okay. Well, if you encounter any issues in that process, if you encounter any delays that you think you might not have a letter of approval by February 27th, please reach out to me as soon as you can so that we can come
Okay.
up with any workarounds on that.
I think we should be fine because we
Okay.
have the city council meeting on the 21st. And so I'm going to present there and tell them which letter of intent do you want me to use? Current building or the new building?
Gotcha. Okay.
And so I'm going to be doing double the paperwork, but that's,
Okay.
yeah, it is what it is. So, okay, well, I don't mean to jam up the session
Oh,
here.
no, you're
So
okay.
thank you.
We're just hanging out. This is just free time for anybody who wanted to stay on a little longer who might have
Okay.
extra questions. So thanks,
Okay.
Melanie.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So anybody else who's kind of hanging out here have any specific questions? If not, if you're just hanging out to see if other people might have questions, it sounds like we probably don't have any more. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.